So if we think about education, it's often divided into three distinct phases. And the first is Education 1.0. So this is primarily education for the industrial age. This is living in a pre-industrial world. In Western Europe, it was pre-1750 villages. You learned through the people around you. So you learned a lot of stuff from your family, the people that you had immediate and ready access to. Unless you were really wealthy, you probably couldn't travel because transportation was difficult. You probably couldn't read or write, and you certainly wouldn't be lucky enough to own a book. And so it's quite difficult to learn about things outside of your area of immediate expertise or your immediate experience. You couldn't learn what was happening 2 or 3 valleys over apart from through word of mouth. You couldn't actually see that yourself. And so what's really interesting about this is that the things that you learned about, you'd learn an awful lot about those things. But you're ultimately quite limited in what you were learning about. So if your family were bakers, for instance, and your thing in the village was to bake, you, from a very young age, would learn the craft of baking. You'd go really, really deep into baking. But if you decided that you wanted to become a shipbuilder, and your village wasn't necessarily all about shipbuilding, it was actually really hard to make that transition from being a baker into a shipbuilder. So if you like, the Education 1.0 was almost predetermined, the things that you lived about. It was immediate, it was localised, and it was based on your experience. So that gives rise to, well, just how prevalent that was and how still that drives us today. If you made barrels in the Education 1.0 world, what would your surname probably be? Cooper. A cooper is a person who makes barrels. Hooper is also a person who makes barrels. But that indicates that surname, is there anybody called Cooper, Hooper in the room? There will be surnames that come from occupations in this room. And that's quite telling, because if your great-grandparent was a cooper, your grandparents would become coopers, your parents, and so you would pass it on through the generations. So ultimately quite limiting. Education 2.0, right, there's a whole bunch of different names there. Education 2.0, we're looking at the Industrial Revolution. So the emergence of factories, urbanisation, everybody coming into the cities. And we looked at factories as being incredibly efficient machines for pumping out stuff, products, cars, clocks, whatever it is that we needed. Factories were incredibly efficient at doing that through specialisation, through division of labour, through the assembly line. This revolutionised the way that we could get stuff. So we looked at those factories and we thought, well, if you can take a really complex thing and break it down into a series of parts, and not have one person know every single thing about the assembly of that clock, but just have them do one thing over and over and over all day, gradually you would assemble the clock. Raw material would come in one end of the factory, and out the other end of the factory would pop clocks. And the clocks would be reliable, they'd be well made, they'd be affordable. The wages that you earned from working in the factory meant that you'd be able to go into a shop and buy a clock. There was this wonderful kind of symmetry to it. We looked at those kinds of machines and they were incredibly efficient. And we thought, well, assembling a human being is quite a complex thing. Why don't we bring the same logic to that? The kind of efficiency of the factory, why don't we bring it to schools? And so we have what's known as the factory model of schooling, or the industrial model of schooling. And this is Education 2.0, where we put raw products in one end of the factory. Let's call them 5-year-olds. And then one person would do something to those kids. They'd teach them some things in one room, and then they'd pass them down the assembly line or the corridor into another room, and somebody else would do something to them, and so they would go down the corridor and eventually pop out, hopefully, a fully functioning member of society who's able to walk and talk and hold down a job and do all those kinds of things. And it was an incredibly efficient way of moving knowledge from one generation to the next generation. So you would have 30, 40, 50 people in a room, and the clever person, teacher, would start talking or writing stuff up, and the other 30 or 40 people in the room would catch that knowledge as quickly as they could. Because what we didn't want was for a new generation to come through not knowing everything that the previous generation knew. Because if we got to that point where they knew less, we'd actually be going backwards as a civilization. So this machine was incredibly good at sharing and moving knowledge, moving information. Education 2.0. So we looked at these features of the factory and thought, well, the efficiency of the factory is built on a bunch of these things. you know, there's a hooter that sounds to let everybody know that your shift has started, and another one that sounds when it's finished. So why don't we bring that in? Where did that appear in schools? We didn't have hooters, but we had bells, right? So we bring these across. We didn't dress them up in kind of overalls and send them in, but pretty close. We have uniforms, all look the same, all look orderly and neat and tidy, and learn how to wear a uniform. We didn't have shifts, but we certainly did have timetables. You need to turn up at this place and do this thing. Get ready for the work world. Get ready to turn up and do the right thing. In terms of batch production, we'd ship through a batch of clocks. That came across as year levels, you know. Ken Robinson says it's like the most important thing about these kids in the industrial world was their date of manufacture. It's not what you can do. I don't care whether you're Mozart, you're actually year 3, and this is what we're doing in year 3. And soon you'll get to do some fun stuff later on. So the idea of batch production. Division of labour got broken into year levels and subjects, where I said I'm an English and history teacher. I did not say I'm a teacher of children. You know, I've compartmentalised myself into that thing because that's the division of labour, the specialisation. The identical products, you don't want weird and wonderful clocks popping out of the factory, some of which work and some of which don't. You want some kind of certification as a result of that to say if you reached School C and you got a stamp that says you got School C in this or you got 62%, you're roughly the same as other people who got 62% in that subject, and there's a kind of official stamp that goes on you. And rules and procedures, well, we just brought as many of those in as we could. And so we kind of chuckle at this stuff, the industrial model, the factory model. Is there anybody having flashbacks to their school days? I certainly am. But how many of those things on the right are still in place in most schools? Most of them, right? So this is a big, big draw on us. As educators, what we're recognising is that the factory world has disappeared. We're no longer preparing people for those kinds of jobs. You can't just do the same thing over and over again for 30 or 40 years and then at the end of your career get a gold watch and wander off. We don't work like that in this world. But in the industrial world, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, as a teacher, you'd pop out of training college and probably for the next 35 years, you could teach in exactly the same way, probably using the same lessons. And nothing would change. There was no big challenge to that. Nowadays, we're talking about the rate of change. If you're teaching the same way you were teaching 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you're already slipping behind. So this is the big challenge that we're facing. Education 1.0, 2.0, we go into education 3.0. But the big thing is that a huge part of the machine was about obedience and creating good, compliant workers to go out into the workforce. So this idea of the hidden curriculum, what we're really trying to do is get kids just to the point where they're good at following orders, just doing as they're told, running through the system, and that eventually will be perfect workers for this world. Now, the hidden curriculum is really important. I'm a big fan of politeness, punctuality, neatness, those kinds of things. But the challenge that we're facing, you're facing, raising kids, and we're facing as educators, is that the hidden curriculum is still important. But if you just quietly have respect for authority and just wait to be told what to do, and you just go through the motions and do the same thing day after day after day, you're probably falling behind in the skills that are needed in the workplace and in the community, because change is so constant. Change is so prevalent that we constantly need to be improving things rather than just be told or waiting to be told what to do. So this hidden curriculum is a bit of a challenge for us. We need it, but it's no longer enough to prepare kids for the world that they're going into. So education 3.0, what is this? What is future-focused education? This is the thing that we all collectively are grappling with. And the answer is, we don't really know. Kind of making it up as we go along. What we're trying to do is respond to the big trends and the challenges that you are seeing daily in your lives. There are some really clear things that we know kids need to be able to cope with. And if we create an education system that prepares them for those things, then we're probably doing a pretty good job of working out what education 3.0 is. So what I want to do is just have a look at some of these big trends, drivers of change, what are the things that we need to cope with this Education 3.0 world? Thankfully, there are some very clever people that help to guide us on this. One of them's Harvard Professor of Innovation, Tony Wagner. And he's identified 3 big trends that are changing the world, changing the globe, really. The first is this idea that knowledge is a commodity. It's free like air or water. Historically, if you think back to the industrial model of schooling, the knowledge was often tied up in people's heads. Books were still reasonably expensive when the industrial model of schooling was in its heyday. Schools could afford textbooks and books, and they could also store knowledge in people's heads. And the trick was to get all that knowledge out as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. So we built big places, we'll call them schools, and we sent clever people there and the kids to be near those clever people in the hope that they would learn. And if you didn't get the stuff, if you didn't fully understand the Pythagorean theorem, or you didn't fully understand the periodic table or get all that information, it was actually quite hard just wandering down the street to get it. You needed to get it at school. But now we've got devices, just as in the last 5 years or so, smartphones connected, 3G, 4G mobile, we've got YouTube, we've got Wikipedia, we've got all sorts of things. We've got the Khan Academy, we've got the ability to learn beyond school. So there's a big, big challenge to that traditional industrial idea of what school is. You go to school to get the stuff, to learn, but if you don't learn it at school, it's not the end of the world. You can actually access it on the bus, you can get it at a cafe, you can certainly get it at a public library, you can get it anywhere where there's a device and there's an internet connection. And so then if schools have traditionally or historically been about just transferring information, moving it from one person's head to another, and that need is actually not quite as important in the Education 3.0 world, then what is the point of school? There will always be a need for a teacher to teach stuff to kids, but it's no longer the only thing that we do. So that's one of the big challenges, or one of the big trends that we're coping with in education. Wikipedia, the mission statement of Wikipedia, is to make freely available the sum total of all human knowledge to everyone anywhere on earth. And that's really encroaching on what historically schools have done. And they'll do it far better than we will. They'll do it with video and they'll do it freely available, everything. So there's a big challenge, how accessing information. Second one, any job that can be routined is rapidly being offshored or automated. So we spent a bit of time in September talking about this stuff. The Google self-driving cars are in the news again today. They are literally machines, computers, driving cars on the streets of Southern California, on the freeways. And they've clocked up 2.4 million kilometres in these cars. They've had several accidents, all of which have been caused by human beings not paying attention. The cars themselves are far better, or the machines are far better at driving the cars than we are. So if you're in the transportation industry, if you're a truck driver, if you're a courier driver, if you're a taxi driver, if you're a bus driver, if you're whatever, those machines are coming for your jobs. Because the act of driving, steering, changing gear, accelerating, braking, can be routined. So it's being automated. That's a real challenge for anybody who's looking to go into material moving and transportation. So those jobs are drying up. Charles Ledbetter is another one of the big researchers that do the work in this area, and again, he sums it up really, really nicely. This is the challenge that our kids are facing. They're not going to work in factories anymore. We have robots, we have mechanisation. There are robotic forklifts now that just drive around without a human being on them, picking up stuff and moving it around. So this is the challenge. Our kids will make their lives through creativity, ingenuity, and imagination. So again, okay, what are the implications for schools? Schools need to be not just machines to deliver information and transfer information, but machines for creating, sparking that imagination, sparking that curiosity about the world. I certainly didn't, I don't know about you, I wasn't at school too long ago, but I certainly didn't find that my curiosity and my wonder in the world was sparked on a daily basis. It would be a rare teacher who did it, and I still remember those teachers to this day. Most of it was pretty grim, ploughing through a textbook, memorising stuff, copying notes down off the blackboard. It wasn't about curiosity and imagination. So let's have a little quiz. Can you name all of these robots? C-3PO, well done. R2-D2, Star Wars double. Wooly, yay. And the last one? Robocop, who technically is a cyborg, not a robot. What about these ones? Name these robots. ATM. Self-check at the checkout at the supermarket. Library. Air New Zealand kiosk. What have these got in common? Well, they've replaced human beings doing their jobs. So you hit it right the first time. All of these are robots. And so instead of going to a librarian, you scan your barcode. Have you got these? Yeah. You've certainly got the supermarket checkouts. Supermarkets are falling over themselves to install these and to herd you like cattle through because these are far cheaper than checkout operators. They don't have sick days like checkout operators. They work 24 hours, unlike checkout operators. And these are all examples of robots that, once you're tuned into it, you see these everywhere. They're robots who are doing jobs that people were doing 5 or 10 years ago. Routined, automated, either offshored or done by a computer. So any of those kind of low-level tasks where you just routinely do stuff again and again and again, those jobs, those days are numbered. This is, if you want to ask what future-focused education is trying to cope with this kind of rapid change in the kinds of skills needed in paid and unpaid employment. This is a big challenge that you will be facing daily. So this is the graph that I showed in September. And this is one of the things that I want to show again. Those of you who saw this last time, you'll be able to tell the people on your table exactly what it is. But these are all the different sectors in the US economy. This is a landmark Oxford University study that came out 2 years ago. And they looked at which of those sectors was most vulnerable to job loss through computerization. So checkout operators fitting into the service industry, they're pretty vulnerable, checkout operators. We might say taxi drivers with the self-driving cars, they're pretty vulnerable over the next 10 to 15 years. And I won't do the big make you guess which sectors are most vulnerable, but that's what the graph looks like. And the crucial things to observe, 0 means it's almost impossible for a computer to do your job over the next 10 to 15 years. 1 means it's almost inevitable that a computer will do your job over the next 10 to 15 years. And so the big chunks of colour in here are that kind of tan colour, red and pink, which you'll see as service, sales and office and admin support. So think of the librarian, think of the person at the Air New Zealand kiosk, think of people in the checkout. Those are all service sector jobs. Think about people who now, has anybody bought anything on TradeMe ever? Yeah. So sales reps, you're doing sales reps out of a job when you're buying stuff on the internet. You're connecting a person with a need with a person who can meet that need without a bunch of middlemen all the way through. So there are jobs, that's not to say there won't be any sales reps in the world, but there will be far fewer of them and they'll be offering a very personalised service and they'll probably be able to charge for that service as well. So the other crucial thing is this line here at 0.7, and that number there, 47% of the people currently employed in the US fit into the category of high likelihood of job loss through computerisation. Look in this room, that's 1 person in every 2 who's in paid employment who will probably be doing a job that a smartphone app or a robotic forklift or a checkout machine will be doing in 10 or 15 years' time. So we talk about the rate of change and the pace of change. This is where it's at, because if our kids, they pop out and they get into a job that they just absolutely adore and love, and then 10 or 15 years later, having had a wonderful, thrilling career, they realise that a smartphone app has replaced them, that's what they have to cope with. They have to pick themselves up off that, and they have to go again and find something else to do. If they want to continue to contribute, if they want to have a sense of identity and feel a sense of pride in themselves, if they want to support their family, if they want to be a contributing member of the community, all of those kinds of things, then they're going to need the resilience to be able to come back from these kinds of challenges. they're going to, this is a cheap phrase, it's used over and over again, but it's absolutely true. They're going to need to be a lifelong learner, to be able to learn, unlearn, relearn, to learn by themselves, to learn with others, to learn on the job, to learn through technology, to learn however they need to do it. And the more dependent they are on a teacher at the front of the room, the less likely they're going to be able to do that when they turn 30 or 35 or 40. If they think the teacher is the one who caused that learning in them and it wasn't the learner themselves, then they're going to be in a real pickle, because they're going to be looking around for that teacher to tell them what to learn next. So this is at the crux of future-focused education. This is what we're trying to do in schools, is to create these, the technical term for it is self-actualizing learners. Kids who can turn themselves into the people that they want to be and the people that they need to be. So this is fairly terrifying, this piece of research. It quite literally keeps me up at night. Doesn't matter whether you're in a factory, this is the Foxconn factory in China, 1 million human beings, the few remaining people left in their factory, 1 million people replaced with 1 million robots. But here is the City of London, quantitative analysts, bankers, investment bankers, lawyers, being automated out of their jobs by computers that are incredibly good at doing calculations and, scarily, getting better at machine learning from their own mistakes and improving. They can do that far faster than we can because they can do those calculations. So what skills do we need? There's some big words in here. Routine cognitive, those are pretty easily structured into rules-based processes. Non-routine cognitive, that's kind of weird problems that you haven't struck before that you still have to solve. Routine manual, digging a hole or doing something physically, putting a spring on a cog in a factory. Non-routine manual, doing something physical but it's different every time. And non-routine interpersonal, a lot of interaction with human beings. This research looked at each of those 5 skills and since 1960 asked, have these become more in demand or less in demand? And again, this is in the paid workforce, but you can draw a pretty strong parallel to the unpaid workforce as well. So if we benchmark at 50, all of those in 1960, and say that over time, some of them become more important and some of them have become less important, talk on your tables about which ones you think are now more important than they were in 1960, which ones less important. I'll give you 30 seconds. There are the little worms, and you'll see non-routine interpersonal. Being able to work as a team, work with a diverse team, being able to get on with other people, soft skills are far more in demand than they were in the 1960s and far more in demand than all of the others. Next is non-routine analytical or non-routine cognitive, so that's solving original problems. So the answers in the back of the book, those textbooks that we've relied on for a very long time, non-routine analytical, non-routine cognitive are things where there isn't an answer in the back of the textbook. You're striking this problem for the first time. That is one of the key skills that we use daily. We haven't quite seen this. There's no answer in a manual somewhere, but we still have to solve this problem. So those two together, the trend has been consistent right the way through second half of the 20th century into the 21st century. If we want to really prepare kids for the workplace, and bearing in mind that schools, that's only one part of the function of schools. We're not just preparing kids as units of labour for the economy. There's a really important social and community function that we provide in schools. But if we do want them to be able to go into paid employment, we need to be able to teach them how to get on with others and work as a team and how to solve problems that they haven't seen before. Problems that don't have a ready answer sitting in the back of the book. The one that we have traditionally spent most of our time on in schools is which one? Routine cognitive. Not because it's important, but because it's easy to test. You can measure it easy. When you're doing timetables or you're doing spelling or how many of the periodic table can you memorise, there's a right or a wrong answer. But how is this community going to achieve a particular thing, or what's the best approach that this school should take to do this thing? That's never been solved before. This is a real world, authentic, original problem. So it's not that they're the important skills that we've been focusing on for a very long time. It's the ones that are easiest to outsource, digitise, automate, and easiest to test. So thankfully, the New Zealand curriculum has anticipated all this stuff beautifully, because when I went to school, that was the curriculum, the learning areas, English, maths, science, all that sort of stuff. And in 2007, the New Zealand curriculum recognised that that is important, but it's no longer the only story. In addition to learning about that stuff, you also need all these soft skills. You need values like excellence, striving to be the best that you can be. You need innovation, inquiry, curiosity, diversity, equity. You also need key competencies of thinking, making meaning, participating, contributing, relating to others, all of those kinds of things. They don't replace the learning areas, but they're in addition to the learning areas. When you're doing your stuff in the learning areas, English, maths, science, you should also be working on those soft skills at the same time. They're inseparable. So it's really good to have this document, to be actually enabled to achieve this stuff, and I think it is one of the most forward-thinking progressive curricula that we have in the world. So that's exciting. But there's a bunch of other stuff that we're now discovering, we're learning that we didn't know in that kind of industrial world. And a whole bunch of stuff about the brain. What do we know about the brain? Different ways of teaching. There's a really, really nice there's a nice piece of research that talks about how involved kids are in their learning, planning their own learning, setting goals, organising their learning, evaluating themselves, monitoring their progress. And there's a really nice link between kids who are given opportunities to do that and the development of the part of the brain that controls what's known as executive function. So higher order thinking, problem solving, being able to use reason, to use logic. Those kinds of things are really closely linked to those key competencies. If you're good at managing yourself, if you're good at setting goals and working to achieve those goals, your brain gets stronger, and as Bruce Feiler says, they take more control over their lives. Contrast that with the industrial model of education, where we're sitting there just being educated, being told what to do. We weren't necessarily that involved in setting goals or negotiating outcomes. And that was one of the clear markers of that industrial model of education. That was fine for its time. Sugata Mitra won the TED Prize in 2013, visionary educator. And he says it's okay, the industrial model, we don't have to rail on it too much. It's not that it's broken, it's just that we don't need it anymore. We actually need something else. And we're in the process of inventing that something else. This third one, if we go back to Tony Wagner's ideas, what the world cares about is not what you know, but what you can do with what you know. And you'll see in schools, future-focused schools, more opportunity for kids to demonstrate their learning in a way other than a multi-choice test or a quiz that can be marked out of 10. So an opportunity to actually solve real-world problems, build things, make things. And what's important about this is that it's the kind of convergence of the stuff that's needed out there in the world, kids that can motivate themselves and become self-actualizing, but also a bunch of research that's coming out about the brain and just how important it is to be involved in solving those real-world problems and doing something with your learning. This idea of being really dependent on your teacher. Dylan William is a formative assessment guru. It's actually about making sure that they can do stuff in addition to just doing what they're told. Learn, unlearn, relearn. Constantly changing, constantly being able to adapt to what is required of them. Not this, not this. Does anybody who was here in September remember this graph? This is a printout of a tertiary student's electrodermal activity. So your brain triggers, electrodermal, high activity when you're learning, when you're emotionally engaged, or when you are physically exerting yourself. Can you remember what that yellow line was? School. Lecture. So when we put the times on, class, so there's a bit of an irony here that you're all sitting quietly listening to me, probably flatlining in your brain. And when I asked you to turn and talk to your neighbours, your electrodermal activity would have just gone crazy. So this thing that lecture or just standing up and talking, hoping that kids would catch it, is actually not borne out by what we now know about the brain. And what was really interesting is that it happened across the whole week for this particular student. Whenever you're just sitting, listening, or being lectured to, your brain is actually fairly close to being asleep. Blue, by the way, is sleep, and it's far more active than being in a lecture, right? So when we were designing the industrial model of education, we didn't know this. We've only had access to this stuff in the last 15 years since the invention of fMRI scanning. We can actually see inside people's brains. We didn't know this. This is crucial information, because if we want high levels of brain activity, we should probably stop lecturing kids. We should stop talking at them for 6 hours a day. So we're learning this as well. John Hattie, you might have heard of him, reasonably famous researcher. Active learning, labs, in terms of solving problems with your learning. Engaging in group work increases the amount of on-task time. Students are least engaged when lecturing or watching. So what should education, future-focused education be? Less reliance on a teacher standing up and talking for an hour or 2 hours or 6 hours, and more active learning, more building. It increases the engagement time, motivation, and the rate of learning. This is research that we have only just had access to in the last 10 or 15 years. So this is changing the way that we design schools, changing the way that we put learning together. So here's two, composite of 20 students on the left and a composite of 20 students on the right. And they were taking the same test. You can see by that thermal imaging that there's a far higher level of brain function in the students on the right. That group had higher levels of concentration and attention, better recall and memory, higher performance on the assessment as a whole. And they did one thing different from the group on the left. What did they do just before the assessment? Exercise. 20-minute walk. It's not even vigorous exercise, but it's getting oxygen moving to the brain. So this is quite a landmark study that we didn't have access to 10 or 15 years ago. Regular exercise, moving around the classroom, dare I say it, not sitting on your bums like you guys are right now, increases the likelihood that you're going to remember stuff. So there's more and more research now coming about the importance of the body and movement and the connection with the brain and learning. We'll go through a wee bit more. But that's quite a stunning study that shows the opposite. It's counterintuitive, or counter to what we've held true for 150 years, that if you're sitting quietly and copying your stuff down, you're a good learner. Actually, the brain science is not bearing that out. There are times when you need to do that, absolutely, but also times when possibly standing up might be the best thing that you can do to assist your learning. So the body and movement, standing tables. Who uses standing tables at home or at work? Yeah. So Texas A&M found that standing desks improved classroom attention and engagement by an extra 7 minutes per hour. If I told you, add that up over the year. And engagement constitutes things like putting your hand up and answering questions, being focused on task, not distracted, not talking to your neighbour, all of that sort of stuff. 7 minutes per hour for this group that were just given standing tables, the ability to stand up as well as sit down. There's more and more of it. This is kids with ADHD, foot tapping, leg swinging, chair scooting movements. Children with ADHD are actually vital to how they remember information, work out complex cognitive tasks. So that's my favourite journal title, Journal of Abnormal Child Psychology. I'm the editor of the Journal for Abnormal Child Psychology. What do we do when those kids are bouncing and shuffling and tapping their feet and all that sort of stuff? We tell them to stop fidgeting, stop moving. But in fact, that's probably one of the best things. If these kids are ADHD, what we do is probably medicate them to stop them tapping and bouncing around. What we should do is probably just let them stand up and walk around and learn. So the more and more of this sort of stuff about the brain that's challenging our traditional notions of what a classroom is, what a learning environment is, and how kids learn best in that environment. So you see, it's hard to read this, but here's a school that provides kids a little bit of choice by saying, actually, these some spelling workshops over the course of this week. Do you need help with adding suffixes? Do you need help with the Y ending? Is that something that you need further support on? Rather than just saying, you're coming to this workshop, or we're going to teach the whole class this particular skill, one simple question that you can ask the kids to make choices and give a bit of control to their learning is, which one do you need? And book yourself in, come to that. And you can see the kids putting their names next to it. Now, of course, the teacher alongside that is saying, if a kid hasn't put their name down for the adding suffixes workshop, and you know quite well that they need to go there, then there's less choice for that learner until they develop the skills and the self-awareness to know which one they're getting into. So a whole bunch of stuff. This is choice, control, collaboration, potent strategies for increasing academic achievement. Young people are likely to be more motivated, engage in an activity when they have voice into how it's conducted and and can affect how it concludes. Some pretty landmark stuff about the importance of voice and choice and control and collaboration. So working with the teacher rather than just doing quietly what the teacher tells them to do. And so what's really reassuring about that is that it's not only the skill that you need in the world, but it's also really well borne out by research. There's some good, strong research coming around this. So this is by way of talking about when you go into a classroom and see some weird, wacky stuff going on, like kids putting their names up for a little workshop, there's some really strong research sitting behind it, and there's some really powerful thinking that's taking place. Won't cover that. Just to say that teacher as activator is far more powerful. For me, this is about looking at those kinds of classrooms. Thankfully, outside of secondary schools, you said that very quickly, you don't see these kinds of classrooms much. But when you look at those kinds of classrooms and you say that, that's the classic industrial marker, for me, it's like going to the dentist. When you go to the dentist, you want to see the TV on the screen, you want to see the dentist, the latest research, the journal sitting there on his desk, he's keeping up to date and have the fancy machine, all that sort of stuff. What you don't want to do is go into something that looks like a horror show out of the 1960s. And so when we look at those kind of mental models of classroom with all the desks lined up facing the front, doing the straight sort of thing, untouched by 30 or 40 years of research into the brain, there's a bit of a challenge there. We need to make sure that the decisions that we're making about classrooms are in fact informed by our current thinking. And so what I would like to do is just show a couple of examples. I'm going to stop talking, just show some examples of schools that are doing a similar sort of thing. So this is a school in the Waikato. Last year there was a big whiteboard at the front of that classroom, which is now lime green. And the teacher kind of taught from the front, and everybody, 30 kids, would face the front and do what the teacher asked them to. And this school is now starting to explore different ways of doing things. So there are a range of different whiteboard spaces around. There are monitors for teachers to use their devices. There are whiteboards to do some micro-teaching. But there are also spaces for kids to teach each other. And so you're activating that peer tuition. That is such a powerful strategy. Kids learn better from each other than they do from adults in peer tutoring situations. Research pretty categorical about that. That doesn't mean that a teacher can just set up a whole bunch of peer tutoring relationships and go to the beach for the rest of the year. That's in addition to very good quality direct instruction, not as a replacement to that teacher. But instead of the teacher doing all the drilling and going around the class and working out where everybody's at, more and more reciprocal teaching, more and more peer tutoring goes on. And so the layout or the design of the classroom shifts in order to accommodate that. So these chairs that you see at the back here, those are pushed against the wall, so the kids are sitting there doing their stuff. They can be spun around and really easily create a peer tutoring environment. So it's a very agile learning environment that can reconfigure based on whether the teacher's doing something for the whole group or whether it's time to do group work, work in small teams or individual work. So agile learning environments. Standing tables, so you've got the opportunity to work standing up in small groups as well as sitting down. Much more active collaboration. So, if you go in and you think, well, these kids should be learning with a teacher, actually they will be learning with a teacher, but they'll also be learning with each other. They'll be engaged in project work, they'll be working together, building those interpersonal skills. This for me is a lovely little summary. If you can see all the kids in there, spot the learners and what they're doing. There's a lovely little table down here with a collaborative kind of campfire getting together space. That's deliberately designed to facilitate collaboration. That's about kids working together as a team. But in addition to that, there's some peer tutoring going on these little seats here. There's some independent learning there. There's some active learning, kids standing up with their learning. And what's most important is the fact that they're empowered to be able to know what it is that they're working on and to be able to choose the space with high trust and high accountability with their teacher, I might add, so that there are agreed outcomes. At the end of this 15-minute sequence, you bring this thing back to me to show me that you've done it. But it's a negotiated process rather than a totally teacher-directed process. Quiet, independent spaces. Teacher-led instruction. You do a quick head count there and you'll notice that this teacher is responsible for 30 kids, but there aren't 30 kids taking part in this piece of direct instruction. That was one of the myths of the industrial model, is that, you know, if you were doing a lesson to 30 kids, you just assumed that they were all at exactly the same place, they all had exactly the same learning need, and you could go one uniform average speed and everyone would get it. The more we know about learning, that has always been a myth. The way that you learn, the speed, the depth, the things that you're interested in is as unique as your fingerprint. And so you won't see big direct instruction sequences done to 30 kids because some kids are lost and they're not ready for this yet, and some kids were well past this a week ago. And so a group of 12 or a group of 15, like we're seeing here, is now much more common, while the other kids are doing peer tutoring, reciprocal teaching, independent research, drill and practice, all of those other different components. And again, you need an agile learning environment in order to be able to do that. A range of different learning settings, some high tables, low tables, all designed to facilitate collaboration. Breakout rooms, previously that was a corridor and a toilet, much more useful. Outside of new entrants, kids actually don't need to be 10 paces from a toilet. They can actually, you know, like human beings, find their way to the loo when they need it. And these adjacent spaces that have historically been corridors, cloakrooms and toilets are really valuable learning spaces, because if that's set up to really facilitate or develop wonder and curiosity in science, kids can be in there, and I as a teacher have got wonderful passive supervision of them. I can see exactly what they're doing. I don't need to be in that room because it's adjacent to our learning area, but I can let them really, you know, if somebody brings in a cicada shell after morning tea, we can just let that group go and really explore what that thing is with the microscopes and all that sort of stuff while I carry on working with the rest of the class. So the flexibility, the agility. So that's, that's a pretty wide-ranging set of topics, starting from the history of education. I apologise for that. The drivers of change, the kinds of technology in particular, the way that it's impacting on education. Some research into the brain and how this new emerging stuff is changing the way that we do learning. And also what I did was finish on some examples of learning environments that try to enact those kinds of things, that need to develop the soft skills as well as deep content knowledge in learners, but also that acknowledgement that interpersonal skills, the original problem solving, is really, really important. So I'm going to pause here for a second and just give you a chance to talk to each other. What's interesting, what's challenging, what's confronting, what would you like to hear more about? What's pushing your buttons? Just take a couple of minutes and then we'll take a few questions and then we're in. The comment was that the industrial model of education is unrecognisable from what's happening in a lot of schools, and I'd say you're quite right. There are, however, schools in this country that when you add some colour to those photos are identical, they're unchanged. And so part of what we're doing as an education system is saying, when you walk into any of these wonderful classrooms, you'll see a whole bunch of really good progressive practice, the kinds of stuff that we're talking about. And actually, it doesn't have much to do with the buildings because it's been happening for a very long time. What we're doing is trying to, we're as a country, we're trying to get a really clear vision of what it is that we want to achieve. Part of it is engaging with those schools that are unchanged and have not changed for 150 years. But also the conversation is about this is where our practice is. It may be fantastic and it will have been progressing for a very long time. There's no kind of magic switch where we flicked from the industrial model to the post-industrial model. This has been evolving for a very long time. The conversations around most of the buildings that we have in this country, 40% of them, the teaching and learning blocks that we have in this country, were built in the 1950s and 60s. And so they were built in a time when that industrial model was in its ascendancy. And what we're doing, what this school's doing, what schools up and down the country are doing is saying, we've got this wonderful vision for a really progressive education that sets our kids up to be wonderful citizens and to be successful and to be happy in life. And we're using these kind of old corridor classroom built environments to try and achieve that. If we didn't have that, if we could make some changes, what would we do? So that's really the conversation. I agree with you, but also think wider across the system, there's also some more work to be done.
I think all you're saying about the progressive practices sounds fabulous, but if anything, they would seem to require higher staff-to-pupil ratios. I don't understand how they lead to classrooms of 60, and with all its attendant disadvantages in terms of distraction and noise and how the introvert deals with that and the ability to think profoundly about challenging new subjects. That's the leap from the progressive to this classroom of 60. That's the bit you haven't explained, and I find hard to understand.
So in terms of moving from one particular set of classrooms to an agile or an innovative learning environment, a modern learning environment is what the ministry calls them, the funding, it would be lovely to have more funding to have more teachers in classrooms. That's not going to happen. It's not going to change. The ratios are exactly the same. We would love that. The two big advantages to having teachers working in the same space as each other, two big advantages are the ability for them to collaborate and use each other's strengths, which historically has not been an opportunity available to the traditional lone teacher in a classroom. If I'm no good at maths or no good at music or no good at art, then those kids for me for 12 months just don't get that opportunity. And so one of the big advantages is for us to be able to learn from each other's strengths. But the second big advantage is for us as a community of practice, more than one teacher in an environment, to share the strategies, the wisdom, the insights for us as a professional learning community. Because when I work in a traditional classroom with nobody to see my practice, nobody to give me feedback on how to get better as a teacher, I'm just not able to advance as well as if I've got another 1, 2, 3 teachers in that same space. So those are the two big advantages of working with more than one teacher in the space.
But surely teachers get assessed every year,
Yep, they do. So what has happened historically is that you'd have 1 or 2 observation lessons a year, and you'd plan very well for those because you know when they're coming. Yeah. But what happens for the rest of the year? So another graph that I showed last year in September, those of you who are here would remember, was the variance between schools and the variance within schools based on the PISA data, PISA, the Program for International Student Achievement. And it showed that counter to the narrative of some schools being really awesome and other schools being failing, that sometimes gets into the media in this country, the big challenge that we have is the variance within the same school. So teachers within the same school, some of whom are doing a stunning, stunning job, and some of whom need help to do a stunning job. And so that community of practice helps with that. Whatever high stakes metric you look at, whether it's national standards, ASTEL data, PAT, NCEA, school leaver data, PISA, you name it, it shows that within school variance is far, far greater than between school variance. So it's the learning that we do within the school that's far more important than the learning we might do, learning from what other schools are doing.
So the research suggests that we all need to be trained to be managers so we can manage these robots because they're going to take over our jobs. But what I'm interested in is that is this kind of change that's happening within the schools, is it related to decile? Are all the schools changing at the same rate? Or, because that's the concern, isn't it? That it's all very well here.
Yeah.
You know,
So the question was, is this related to decile? I work up and down the country. I work with hundreds, literally hundreds of schools across all deciles from 1A to decile 10. And I can safely say, again, with the exception of a few, just about every school in the country is looking hard at their physical environment alongside their vision for teaching and learning and making sure that both are really future focused. It's not just a decile related thing. It's a good question.
The teachers must be very excited about this change because it would be a lot better to stand in a classroom and teach this way than in the industrial period. But what are they doing to facilitate their learning and at Teachers College? I mean, are they changing how they're going to be teaching teachers, if you like?
This is a big challenge for everyone. It's a big challenge for us as parents. It's a big challenge for teachers. So there are teachers who are wildly excited about co-teaching and collaborating, and others for whom it presents a really serious challenge. So it's not universal that everybody's really excited about co-teaching and working as part of a team. But if the question's about how do we prepare teachers for this, Teachers College is helpful, but it's only 1 or 3 or 4 years of your teaching experience. And so if you can get really useful information there, that's a good starting point. But we always say it's the next 35 years of your career that are probably the most important. And that's one of the lessons about that rapidly changing skills requirement of the world. It's actually the learning you do on the job. So that's where we go to the school and we say, what are your internal professional learning processes so that every teacher is learning every day to be a better teacher? That's a really, really important part of the process.
What guarantee can you give us as parents that once there are all these giant classrooms that for 2 teachers and 60 children, that the ministry is not then going to say, oh, maybe we can do with 1 teacher and 1 learning assistant, or maybe we can just do with 1 teacher? I mean, how can we be confident that this just is not, these giant classrooms are just not as slippery slope to higher ratios?
So the question is, how can we be sure that giant classrooms or co-teaching spaces is not a slippery slope to decreasing funding? I don't work for the ministry. I can't give you any assurance for the ministry.
Because
so
it strikes me that this sort of research and these new giant technologies, they're a gift to the ministry who are obviously looking to cut funding.
If we're cutting funding, then I'll be marching on the streets with you. But what I'm doing, my work is centred around the teaching and learning benefits, not the fiscal or financial benefits. So this is something that I'm committed to because of the research that sits behind it and not because of some kind of agenda that it might save me as a taxpayer money.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your presentation. It was very good. I was interested to understand the process that we have for assessment of national standards. How do you see that working with what you're talking about children's learning?
So the connection between national standards and some of these big aspirational goals that we have for education, the short answer is that while it's really important for kids to be able to read well, write well, do maths, those are the building blocks of learning and the way that you unlock the world. Further learning, if you can't read and write, you just forget about it. While that's important, there is a challenge that teachers are facing daily between a very narrow metric and a curriculum that invites them to develop really well-rounded, holistic, amazing young people. That's a challenge. They're not well aligned. You're quite right to point out that inconsistency. It's something that teachers do every day. It's trying to do the national standard stuff but not be limited by it.
So I know this was sort of touched on before. At Teachers College, say you went to enrol at Teachers College next year, is the whole way that their curriculum that is being delivered to them changing to meet the needs of this new world that we're...
It is changing. There's a variety of teacher education providers, so it's hard to say across the board. But Teachers College, there's 2 things. Teachers College do the best job that they possibly can to prepare teachers to go out into the workforce. It's changing as rapidly as we're experiencing, and so it's hard to keep up with that. But then the other thing, there was an adage that when we were at training college, that training college was great, but you learnt most of the stuff you needed to know when you were in schools. And so that's the other thing about it. There's nothing that replaces actual real life experience in the class.
question. I've noticed in the classrooms you need lots of big screens and TVs, yet you had on one of your graphs that one of the lowest levels of brain activity was when people were sitting in front of the TV.
So the inconsistency or the prevalence of technology compared to the research that suggests that when you're just watching something, you have low levels of brain function. It's true. It's true. Not all screen time is created equally. And if you're just passively sitting consuming something on a TV, that's exactly the same as just passively consuming something on a whiteboard. You're dead right. Having said that, having a big screen in the hands of an amazing teacher is an extraordinary pedagogical tool, particularly when we have things like wireless projection facilities, so that if we've got a group of a dozen kids sitting around here and they've been doing something on an iPad or some kind of device, they can each take turns shooting their little movie up to that screen and sharing and celebrating the work that they've done. And so that's quite different from just putting on a movie, a bit of YouTube, and just watching it. So that again comes back to the skill and the craft of the teacher. I would be quite concerned if anybody were using a screen for any time longer than a few minutes. And it's part of a rich suite of tools that a teacher uses. Yeah, it's certainly not digital babysitting.
I was just wondering, what is Education 4.0 like? The iPhone 6 is out. It's
Yeah.
going to be here soon. We're going to be looking at 4.0.
What is 4.0? That's the question. We're still grappling with 3.0. Yeah. It's a good question. I don't have an answer. I don't know what it is. Managing the distractions? Yeah. It's a very good question. It is a very good question. And at the end of the day, it is one of those things that we as teachers need to be able to develop the skills to be able to do that. We can only be in one place at a time. And so if I'm working with this group, they're on task, and that group's not. And so we need to develop those skills. But also the challenge is to develop in the students themselves those kinds of self-managing skills, knowing when they're on task, the high levels of accountability that if we've given you 5 minutes to complete this thing, you need to be able to show that you've done it and not just talked for all that time. So it's a kind of give and take. It's an extraordinary, if you haven't been into a class recently where there's teachers do this, where they manage groups doing all sorts of different things, reading groups, maths groups, you name it, this is what they do now. And actually it's easier when you have more than one teacher in the space, because you have passive supervision, you have a teacher working here, a teacher working there, you've got more eyes in the room. If you have to leave the room, traditionally learning just stopped, and then somebody would poke their head out the corridor and say, he's coming back, and then they carry on. You know, who hasn't done that, right? And so having more teachers in the room actually helps with that sort of stuff. It's a great question, great question. What's the role of the home in supporting this? You know, if we know that this is the challenge that we're all facing, it's not separate, and then they go to school and something magic happens there and it's completely... The partnership between home and school is absolutely vital. Historically, one of the things we've struggled with homework is that it has been designed to be completed on your own, silently. You know, that's going against what it is that we're talking about here. It should probably be collaborative, it should probably be really engaging and exciting, and it should be quite active. And so we're finding our feet kind of undoing historically what has happened with homework. But I think it's a very good question. There's lots of research to show that homework has limited impact on learning until you get to secondary. So I think that's a really lovely question that Stuart will note. What can the school do to support parents? I reckon that's a lovely conversation to be had. If these are the attributes that we're aiming for as a school here are some opportunities to support those. This is what it might look like at home. I think that's a great connection. Yep. For sure. Minecraft, are you familiar with Minecraft? You probably are if you have kids, right? There are schools that help kids to design new outdoor learning environments, new classroom blocks inside Minecraft. And so, you know, starting not with an assumption that that's just a toy that you just kind of waste time on, but actually we start with the strengths that you have in this particular thing and let's use that for learning. So absolutely. That's another one of those markers of the industrial to the post-industrial. You start with what the kid can do and you build on the confidence and the strength of that. You don't always focus on what they can't do. You'll get to what they can't do eventually, but start with what they can do and build their confidence like that. I think that's a lovely note to end on, actually.